What is up, ladies and gentlemen? My name is Griff, and welcome to the Hashtag Squad. Today, we are going to be looking at Star Citizen 2.6, more specifically, the flight model. And we are going to be evaluating whether or not it is a step forward or a step backwards, and what kind of impact it's going to have on the gameplay. So, as with anything, it's very, very important to kind of establish what got us to the point that we're at now. So, let's take a look at where we stand currently. 2.6 landed into the general public's hands just over 2 weeks ago, and that was after waiting just about 4 months from 2.5 to 2.6. Now, with any patch, and this goes for any game, it doesn't matter if it's Star Citizen or if it's another early access game or if it's a full release game like Blizzard's World of Warcraft, there is going to be a honeymoon period. And that's basically just where it's very easy to say that this is a great patch just because of the fact that there's new content that just came out. So typically after spending some extra time, you start really seeing flaws of the current patch. And I think we're past the honeymoon stage for 2.6. So whenever there's a major update to a game mechanic, I believe it's very important to look at what brought us to the retuning. And that starts back in August, during the final days of Star Citizen 2.4. So August 19th rolled around, and that was Gamescom. And at Gamescom, there were a few really important things that happened, but the number one thing that stands out in regards to the flight model was when Chris Roberts started talking to us about the first whispers of 2.6, and was confirming that it was going to be a supposed love patch for Arena Commander, which would boast flight and combat improvements, as well as general gameplay improvements. So, obviously, if you at all were interested in space combat, you were excited for this patch. This patch was the patch that you have been waiting for over a year now. So, a few days later, after suffering through 2.4, and keep in mind, 2.4 itself was not a bad patch. There were just bad bugs. And that was the major thing that really killed 2.4, were stability and missile bugs as well as camera bugs. So a few days later, we were finally given patch 2.5, which we hoped would fix a lot of the issues with 2.4 and provide mainly just more stability and a more enjoyable combat experience. But, unfortunately, that hope was quickly dashed because we realized that what we traded in stability, we got back in bugs. And really, 2.5 was one hell of a horrible patch to suffer through if you did a lot of Arena Commander. We had a broken ESP, which is Enhanced Stick Precision, which basically, if you don't know what it is, it helps joystick users stay on target. So it was broken, meaning that joystick players had a much harder time staying on target compared to 2.4. And then on top of that, there was a new cockpit glitch. And what this did was it made you have ragdolls in your cockpit. It really sucked. And it made, for most people, to have blocked vision and basically an unplayable experience. So as the months went on with 2.5, other issues became apparent, such as the added benefit ships like the Saber and Gladius were experiencing because of the broken ESP. And what was happening was, because they had such a small profile, anybody that was using sticks or fixed weapons were having a much harder time hitting them because of that. And then on top of that, ships like the Saber were enjoying a way over-the-top shield recharge rate. And as time went on, the disappointment and the dissatisfaction became more and more prevalent. Finally, in the middle of the wait for 2.6, and after hearing rumors and leaks on Reddit, CIG gave us the first views of improvements to both flight and combat in a few videos as well as CitizenCon. And one of the very first things that stuck out to me, and a lot of people that I saw and really talked to, were the slower velocities. We noticed right away that velocities got halved for seemingly several reasons, ranging from combat too far away to ships being too fast and throttle management not being something the devs wanted. So one of the very first things that really stuck out to me concerning these reasons was that it seemed like they came out of left field. I didn't see very many people that were calling for a halving in velocity. I didn't see a lot of people calling for less throttle control. But for some reason, they took our calls for improvement and decided that was what we were asking for. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure there were some people that were doing it, but that didn't seem to be the general consensus from the combat community. So what I usually saw were calls for improvement being on better weapon characteristics or a better missile locking and firing system, and even things so simple as reliable countermeasures. Finally, December came around, and the holiday live stream also. And finally, after waiting for 4 months, which was a very painful process, mind you, waiting for 2.6, it was finally released on December 23rd. And as you might expect, there was a lot of praise. There was a lot of hype, and can you really blame people? I don't think you can, because there was a lot of stuff that people had to suffer through between 2.4, 2.5, and the wait for 2.6. So, to date, I would say 2.6 is the most stable patch we've had. There's not a whole lot of bugs, servers don't crash, it's very stable inside of Arena Commander. So, I think one of the very first things we should be looking at here is, did CIG accomplish what it wanted to with 2.6? So one of the very first things that really stuck out to me was closer fights. And for the most part, I can say yes, they did accomplish what they wanted to get with closer fights. Your above average pilot prior to 2.6, though, could dogfight sub 1,000 meters. But in some cases, and actually I would say most cases, your average player was not able to. And for me, engagements never seem to run past 800 meters in 2.6 unless your target is trying to run. So I kind of think that's a little bit of a downside to 2.6. We gave a lot in order to accomplish a flight model where a average player could get the closer distances. So this brings me to my next point, jousting. We were supposed to eliminate jousting with 2.6. And to be honest, no. It still exists, and CIG didn't even come close to getting rid of it. And in all honesty, they probably never will. Because if anything, this quote-unquote problem just got worse because of how much extra throttle management it takes to not overshoot your target, and just simply how easy it is to use Afterburner to run. Now that being said, although I share the sentiment that jousting is unenjoyable, I also don't shy away from the fact that it's something that exists in every flight game. And for good reason. It is a valid combat tactic. In every single flight game, jousting exists. And in Star Citizen it existed, but it also wasn't that much of a viable combat tactic. If you were caught jousting in 2.5 or 2.4 or any of the 2.x patches, you essentially died. And you died because most pilots that spent a majority of their time developing their combat skills learned exactly how to counter that and exactly how to kill somebody who was trying to joust. Now, throttle management was another reason why they said they were doing the 2.6 flight model changes. In some ways, I can say that throttle management is now trivial. But then again, if you understood the mechanics of flight in combat in 2.5 and prior, it wasn't exactly all that difficult either with proper use of strafe. But there's another side to this, because in another way, it also got much more difficult. Throttle management is now even more difficult than prior patches when in Afterburner. And in fact, it's almost easy to say that for newer players, it's even easier now than it was beforehand to die because of a mismanaged throttle, because of the Afterburner mechanic. And I am not knocking the Afterburner mechanic. I actually wholeheartedly support the Afterburner mechanic. But at the same token, I don't think limiting throttle use is a good idea. And the final point that they listed for having the 2.6 model changes is to make the game more accessible. And in all honesty, I can only say sort of in this regard. For the most part, it's much easier to not smack into something, which was something they wanted, right? but things change quickly when you're using Afterburner or engaging in actual combat. For one, I would say that your average player is now struggling even more than they used to in combat against AI. And on top of that, I've seen multitudes of threads pop up after the launch of 2.6 complaining about pirates now being too hard. And on top of that, it seems to me like even though more people are more confident going into Arena Commander, that they still get wiped by the ace pilots. So in general, I would say the goals of 2.6 were basically trying to solve problems that didn't exist. Now, if we actually go into the good and the bad of this patch, I'm going to start with the good. And the number one thing that I really, really love about this patch is Afterburner. It's an improvement over the old cruise mode. It allows for get disengagement reliably, and it also makes certain tactics like boom and zoom even more viable. But there are issues, but I will address those later. The second thing is the reworked fuel mechanic. Some absolutely love fuel the way it is now, others hate it, and some are just absolutely indifferent. In general, I personally think it's just good. I think it's good. It allows for limits on exactly how much someone can disengage and run, as well as places a premium on management of your own fuel. But like most things with this patch, it has a lot of work to be done before it's actually balanced and right. So this brings me to my third point, high accelerations. These are a very good step in the right direction because it makes sure that fighters feel responsive and are actually effective in their roles. Another odd positive that I'm certain a lot of people are going to disagree with, but is essential in making sure that every ship has a role and every profession is viable. Now, what I mean by this last point is that ships not intended for combat, because of this, are not doing well in combat against vessels that are intended for combat. And I know this is probably a controversial point, and I know that it's an odd point, but what's the point of flying a fighter into battle if, say, a freelancer is super effective in combat against fighters? There's just absolutely no point in bringing a fighter over a freelancer at that point. So let's take a look at the bad of the patch, and there's quite a bit, and I hate to say it, but I personally don't think that this was a good step in the right direction. So the number one offender in this category is the velocity compression. Many problems have sprung up because of the way speed compressions have happened. In regards to this category alone, most ships within a certain role are now extremely similar. In terms of fighters, they all have speed ranging between 140 meters a second to 165 meters a second, essentially leading to all of the fighters behaving almost like they're the same. And basically all this does is it forces you to pick, if you want to be competitive, and if you want to be winning fights, it forces you to pick the fighter that has the highest rotation rate, the most DPS, and the best ability to take damage. Look at the Vanguard. It is absolutely ridiculous right now. I mean, I can literally end a match in a Vanguard in Battle Royale in less than 5 minutes with only guns. That's insane. That ship should not be outperforming dogfighters that are smaller than it, like the Gladius, and yet it is. Because, and this brings me to a second point in regards to the low velocities. Because of the low velocities, we have a few things that make piloting, in a way, a much more limited experience, and for no good reason. For one, angular velocity and velocity has been cut by so much that it's almost impossible to do any meaningful active evasion anymore. It's just simply impossible to generate pip deflection or displacement in pre-afterburner speeds. Your best bet if you are getting destroyed in a dogfight is to either throw missiles at your target, or afterburn away, or just attempt to out DPS the guy. This also makes another aspect of the game much worse. The ability to evade fire from behind. Prior to 2.6, you could fly in a way that both made it hard for your target to hit you, but also someone who was trying to take advantage of the fact that you were preoccupied. Now, in 2.4 and 2.5, it was very, very possible for a good pilot to 1v2, 1v3, or even in some cases 1v4. But that possibility is gone. It's gone without a trace. And in any engagement, if you take fire from the rear, you are going to take a lot of damage, and you are either going to have to run or you're going to die. This, again, brings me to another point within the canopy of the lower velocities. This finally brings me to my last point in regards to velocities. Now, one of the worst things about having a lower velocity cap is the fact that a lot of the maneuvers that the community had come up with, such as, say, the Legacy Instructional Series maneuvers, which a lot of people really loved and a lot of people went and watched those videos, have practically all gone out the window. I see a lot of comments from people saying that they really loved this flight model and didn't like the old one because the old one apparently degenerated into jousting or circle strafing. But that's simply not true. More experienced pilots would circle strafe against a less experienced pilot because they knew that pilot did not know how to counter a circle strafe. But in this new 2.6 flight model, that's all we have is circle strafing. If you're not circle strafing, you're running away, because that's the only two things you can do. Now, this brings me to my next point in what is bad about 2.6. Now that we're off the velocity topic, thank God. Alright, let's take a look at the next thing that's on the list for the list of bad. So the second thing that came up was weapons. And in some cases, there are more weapons options available to players. But in other ways, it's also still very limited and very difficult to come up with weapons loadouts that are effective because of weapons of similar class not having a similar projectile velocity, such as Panthers being over 500 meters a second slower than the Badgers. And to top that off, there are several oddities developed in terms of applied DPS versus the simulated DPS of certain weapons. Panthers, again, are a great demonstration of this. They should, on paper, be better than Badgers. But because of the difference in applied DPS, Badgers are better. The same is true of longswords versus broadswords. We have a size 1 essentially being better than a size 3. This needs some major looking at. This should not be happening. The next thing on my list of bad, and number 3, is pickups. And whether you love them or hate them, in many ways, their existence in a lot of ways serve to disguise issues with the combat and the flight model, as well as promote bad habits. The repair and refuel pickups are the biggest offenders in this class. In terms of repair, the pickup helps to A, promote bad play by essentially allowing a player to prioritize getting a repair over flying smart. Although, really, he can't do that because his options are very limited anyways by the flight model, to be fair. And B, because it helps to disguise problems with ships being too easy to destroy currently. For most ships, essentially killing someone first before they or another person kill you is the only way to survive any sort of 1 versus 2 because of the inability to evade oncoming fire from a third party. This helps to cover up problems with evasion, but it doesn't address the real issues. In regards to the refueling pickups, there's really only one thing this helps cover up, and that's the reliance on boost and afterburner to stay competitive and alive in combat. If you run out of fuel in any ship, you essentially are an easy kill for most players. And if you don't possess the ability to produce any little evasion that you could do afterburner, you are dead. And finally, in the last category here of bad, comes the real big ugly of this patch. Missiles and torpedoes. They've either underperformed or they've overperformed in every single patch that has ever been released, and this is essentially the 5th iteration of Missile Commander. In their current iteration, they give too many points in Arena Commander, and they also absolutely completely destroy certain ships with one blast, even at full shields. And to make matters worse, if they don't kill you, they destroy your combat ability by either making you lose a bunch of components and weapons, or in some cases, they just leave you a drifting, helpless, easy target for everyone around you. On one hand of the equation, for the most part, you can avoid them by hitting Afterburner and trying to get behind cover, but on the other hand, certain missiles like the size 5s from Gladiators are practically impossible to outrun. They do not give up, and they will constantly chase you. They do not stop. And to make matters even worse, these missile pickups, which were supposed to help reduce missile spamming from the tactic of shooting missiles and then killing yourself in order to get more missiles, seems to have only fixed the killing the pilot part of the issue, but made the real issue even worse. So how can CIG go about fixing these problems, and what kind of ramifications do these problems actually have on our current patch? Number one, we need to bring the velocity back up again in order to help promote some more active evasion and allow for a higher skill ceiling again. The closer we get to 2.5 velocities, the better in this regard. This would allow for the ability to create more diverse characteristics between ships in the same class, meaning we would pull away from this feeling that all ships are fairly the same except for weapons and rotation rates. This would also help make a player's ability to fight more than one opponent if the skill level is high enough actually possible again. And the current model modes like Battle Royale are basically going to frustrate the hell out of you, because if more than one person wants to kill you, they will. You will not survive. And I understand some of you guys might not support that idea because it would mean combat would get further away again, but let me get to the end of this video to help better explain why we need this to happen. Number 2, jousting. Yes, it still exists, and it will continue to exist no matter what. We need to get away from this idea that it's fixable, because for the most part, it's not going to be. This is a vehicle game. Vehicles will always have certain tactics that are always going to exist just because of the nature of the velocities that they move at. So, what we as players should be doing is looking for ways to counter it, and there were ways to do it with the old flight model, but you just needed to learn how. We need to stop looking at things that we as players can fix ourselves and stop trying to ask CIG to fix things that don't need to be fixed. Number 3, on the topic of weapons, we need a better logic behind the way weapon damage and velocity are calculated. Weapons within the same manufacturer really should be more or less in the same class in terms of velocity. Also taking into account what chips can use as far as weapon combinations, and, balancing around that would be a great way to try and balance and create viability between mixed weapons loadouts instead of forcing everybody to try and monoboats. Until these kind of things start getting taken into account, we are going to be left with monoboating because nothing else is effective due to either multiple pips or simply not being able to compete DPS-wise. Number 4, pickups. In all honesty, I would not mind seeing these gone. For the most part, it's a step in the wrong direction for AC, and it just helps to disguise the problems. AC was originally never meant to be an arcade game, but more like a sim inside of the sim. It was supposed to be not only just a test bed, but also a place where pilots could learn and do combat without any risk to themselves in the verse. In a sense, it was supposed to be the training grounds for a new pilot. Why have we moved away from this idea? It was a good idea, and it also helped establish a place where new players could get a feeling for the game. In the end, all these pickups serve to do is, number 1, to help cover up problems, and number 2, promote bad playstyles, both of which are not something we should be wanting for either experienced players or new players alike. And then number 5, fuel. There is a remarkable reliance on boost fuel this patch. So in a way, they accomplished their goal of wanting to make it matter even more, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But that being said, it's been a double-edged sword. It's so valuable at this point that it's required to be effective in any sort of PvP. And then, if you run out of boost fuel, you're essentially a sitting duck. There are 2 things I would promote to fix this. The first would obviously be, again, to bring up velocities, and the second would be for certain ships to bring up their fuel intake. Ships like the 85X and the M50 run through fuel so quickly that basically if you do 1 or 2 engagements and you don't get a fuel pickup, you are dead in the water. These problems become increasingly prevalent when you're doing 1v1s in a free flight because you cannot pick up fuel. It does not exist. On to missiles. There's not really a whole lot to say here. I mean, they're just simply overtuned, and they're extremely good at what they do. And that being said, missiles should be good. But the problem here is the effort required to use them compared to the payout of a hit. They're extremely easy to use with a huge payout. At the very least, we should be looking at a system where the amount of effort used to get results should be reflected in the amount of effort required to evade. If we have really effective missiles, they should be difficult to use, but also difficult to evade. However, in most cases, what we have now is easy to use, and depending on the size of the missile, like, all you have to do is just keep your nose pointed towards somebody for a X amount of time. That's not good gameplay. That does not promote skill-based gameplay, which is something this game was supposed to do. There are several documents on how to fix this specific subject, and I could spend an entire video on it. So instead of doing that, I'm just going to post a link in the description below because this is legitimately an in-depth topic that really deserves its own video. Finally, at the end of this video, after all this ranting, let's talk a little bit of philosophy here for a little bit, and you'll kind of start to see where I'm coming from. For the most part, all that nerfing the flight model does is just hurt the game. It hurts the people that have put the time in to become skilled, but at the same token, it also hurts those that are coming into the game for the first time. I used to hear arguments all the time that aiming was too hard prior to 2.6, but do we really want aiming easy? Is that something that we really want? Because let's take a step back and look at this for just one quick second. For someone who is just getting into the game in the persistent universe for the first time, would they rather have their $200 ship go out into a universe where it's easy to aim or easy to evade? In fact, I personally believe that for 90% of the player base, the second option would be much more preferable because it would mean an easier getaway from unwanted combat in the universe. In all honesty, the flight model and the combat in 2.4 and even 2.5 was basically evasion much easier than aim, which, contrary to what a lot of people believe, was a lot more new player friendly while also promoting a high skill ceiling. At the end of the day, new players just get smashed in the current patch even harder than they used to in previous versions. I personally believe that time might have been better spent taking the flight model of 2.4 or 2.5 and figuring out a way to address the issues that new players were experiencing without taking a sledgehammer to the whole thing. A much better idea, in my opinion, would have been to take the flight assist we already had, which were created, mind you, in order to help address issues and make them actually do their job. Take, for example, if people were having trouble with throttle management in drift, adjust comm stab to reduce velocity and in turn make correcting course much easier. Basically, I foresee that if we continue down the road that 2.6 is taking us, eventually people will either get bored or everybody will get tired of the fact that if everyone wins, essentially no one wins in the long run. It will be fun for a while until it starts to really matter, and when people start losing their ships because everyone has an easy time hitting targets, then who actually wins?